Hello, I'm Dr. Randall Tonks from the Department of Psychology here at Camosun College. And I'd like to talk a little bit about intercultural communication. When one goes into an intercultural kind of situation, what is really important is that one comes to understand what the other culture is all about. Here, one of the important things to really consider is what is the cultural worldview? When you go from your culture to another culture, you come to understand the ways in which people see the world, their relationship to nature, their relationship to spirituality and to each other, and all kinds of other aspects of not only economics and every kind of daily things, but children and family and all sorts of things like that. As you start to prepare to go into an intercultural situation, it's likely very good that you turn to books, internet, and other kinds of sources in order to be able to best understand what that other culture is all about and to really get a good sense of it. Ultimately, however, you're only going to get a snapshot of what that culture is and is like. And so what will really happen is when you're on the ground in that intercultural situation, you'll really come to understand things in a clear and better way. What I'd like to do is to identify what I might call the ABCs of intercultural communication as a way to identify some important aspects that you need to think about when engaging into an intercultural kind of situation. A, attitudes. To begin with, we need to understand our attitudes about ourselves, our roles, and our relationships, as well, of course, the attitudes of the people from the culture within which we'll be working. So you understand what those attitudes are all about in terms of all kinds of aspects of culture. As I say, nature, spirituality, and so on. But most importantly, how those attitudes pertain to values. What values are very important within that given culture, and how do those vary from your particular values? How is your culture seen in terms of its values by the people of that culture? Here also, what is really important in terms of values are roles and responsibilities. Within society, we each play a different role, often many roles, and it's important to understand what the roles are and the relationship between those different roles in a given culture. So when you go to the other culture, it's important to understand what your role will be and how you ought to play that role in particular. Part of roles are hierarchical structures. Within our culture, we have a certain kind of hierarchical structure in terms of who has more power and prestige, if you will, as do other cultures. As you go to another culture, it's important to understand what their local and particular kinds of power structures are all about in order that you behave in the most appropriate way given that situation. You also want to consider the different contexts and situations in which you will be operating. Here, what you'll find is that our culture tends to be a rather monocontextual kind of culture, whereby what we tend to do is to act the same in all kinds of different situations. Other cultures, for example, have a very different style of behavior in a business meeting, for example, as opposed to a social setting, even though you may be with the same very people. So the context really matters. Gender is another very important one in terms of roles, hierarchy, and context, and how one interacts with people across gender lines. Come to understand what those will be as you move into the other culture. Secondly, behaviors. Here in particular, we want to talk about non-verbal behaviors and ways in which we communicate in all kinds of ways without even speaking. To begin with, how do we greet people? How do we introduce ourselves to them? And how do we hold hands? Do we shake hands? Do we kiss? One cheek? Two cheeks? Do we embrace? There may be differences here across gender lines as well in terms of how we embrace or greet people from other cultures. How do we dress? What kinds of situations do we dress in one way or another? Do we dress casually, formally, or contextually? We also want to be concerned about how do we stand? How do we sit? When we're standing at a situation, do we stand in a certain way with our arms folded, hands on the hips? These can convey certain kinds of notions to other people. When we sit at, for example, a dinner or a business meeting, where do we sit? With whom? And across from whom? And in what order? We also want to be considering in terms of things like eye contact. Do we look someone in the eye, or do we look away and down? Again, hierarchy and role relations will play a role in terms of how we behave in these kinds of ways. Silence is another important one. When do we stay silent and listen, and when do we speak? These are important considerations when it comes to nonverbal communication across cultural boundaries. C, confederates, companions, and confidants. When we go to another culture, we hopefully will have a confederate or another individual to help us guide our way through it. We may also very well bring companions with us, perhaps a spouse, who will be interacting with others in one way or another, and this may affect our relationships with the people from the other culture because through our spouse and ourselves, we'll be seen in very different kinds of ways. Also, when we are interacting with people from other cultures, we're inevitably going to make mistakes. And so as you make mistakes, remember, turn to your confederate or your insider from that particular culture to help you understand what mistakes you may have made and how you may correct those. In the end, stay calm and confident and continue to work on becoming a better communicator across cultural boundaries. That's it, the ABCs of intercultural communication. Thank you.